After clipping 10 hours off the Queen Mary's Atlantic crossing record, the United States, fastest liner in the world, proudly approaches Le Havre to make her first docking in Europe. And the French turn out to give a royal welcome to the new Queen of the Atlantic.
Stanton Daywalt is the co-chair of the Hampton Roads chapter of the SS United States Conservancy. He's a devoted fan of this beautiful ship, an amateur model shipbuilder, and is the co-author of a new book entitled The SS United States, an Operational Guide to America's Flagship. And I'm delighted to have Stanton here with me here today via video conference. Thank you for being here on the Blue Riband Channel.
Thank you, Steve, for having me.
You are the co-author of this book, along with James Rindfleisch and Samuel Bauer. To start off, there is an interesting story, though, that I was reading in the book's introduction about James, who has since passed away, his widow, yourself, and Mr. Bauer, and how this book creation began. Can you briefly tell us about your co-authors and how the book came to be?
Well, Jim, or James, but a lot of people know him as Jimmy as well. In the 50s and 60s, when he was growing up in Newport News, his father would take him around on their little boats to the shipyard in Newport News and would visit the SS United States while she was in dry dock. They're just kind of cruising around, seeing her from a distance. He fell in love with the ship, and then as he grew up and went off to college and other adventures, and eventually settled back in Newport News with Debbie. When the ship was mothballed and was opened up for tours and the auction in the mid 1980s, he went aboard and thoroughly enjoyed himself. And as it happened, he kept going back. Eventually, he became something of a gopher, as he had put it in his introduction. Eventually, due to Richard Hadley being unable to pay the staff, Jim came on board as the unpaid caretaker. So for the next 7-8 years, he watched over the ship, learned all kinds of things about it, about her. And then one of his former professors at Christopher Newport, Sam Bauer, Jim invited him on board the ship in the 80s as well. And together, along with some other people, they worked on the ship, toured it, poked around. So Sam caught the bug as well. When the ship left Newport News in 1992 for asbestos remediation, Jim thought, hey, now would be a good time to write a book about the ship. Previous books before and since the ship had left for overseas mainly dealt with political and social history. He wanted to do something more, as he considered it, the nuts and bolts about the ship. So he worked on it with all the documentation he pulled off. It didn't go anywhere. This was probably late 90s. He then got in touch with Sam, and Sam offered to help him out with some editing and adding additional information, what have you. This would have been in the early aughts. Again, the book languished in the early to mid teens, 2015, 2016. Unfortunately, Jim had cancer and passed away in 2016 before the book was finished. And then what happened, how I came onto it, was Susan Gibbs of the United States Conservancy was good enough to allow me to tour the ship in detail. And this was in 2019. After that, I got to thinking to myself, there's not really been much as far as people that had a history with the ship after she was laid up. Like, I had never read anything about them, heard anything about them. So I took it upon myself to track these people down. Now, when I was a child, I collected every newspaper article about the ship, being from Virginia Beach. And Jim's name popped up in a newspaper article, and his last name being fairly unique. I managed to find his widow, Debbie, contacted her by email. We started a rapport, talking about the ship. And she eventually invited me to her house, and she ended up bequeathing me several thousand documents worth of ship papers, and
Wow.
also introduced me to Sam. And together, over a period of, well, COVID, over 3 years, we fine-tuned the book and managed to get Schiffer to publish it for us. So it was all a bunch of happy coincidences, and maybe you might even say fate at times as well.
Right. And COVID, although that was not exactly the best time for the country, was, maybe even a benefit for you to get that book together, would you say?
I would, yeah. And instead of, everybody, of course, during that time was cooped up in their houses,
Right.
it was a perfect time for me to pour over the manuscripts as it was submitted to me by Sam. And honestly, I really hadn't talked to Sam over the phone probably for the first year and a half. It was all via email. We pretty much wrote this book together via email.
Wow. That's incredible. Now, the title of the book does say an operational guide, and it's obvious from the moment that you read the first few chapters that there's an abundance of technical information and detail about our design, the construction, and the operation of the ship. And one notable use is the mentioning of frames. I don't know if anybody really understands, but when you're dealing with positioning of areas of on a ship, you refer to the frame members, or the rib cage, basically the actual ribs, and they're all evenly spaced, and you know exactly which frame number it is, and it'll tell you where on the ship it's at. So yet at the same time, but the book is not overwhelming in technical detail in which the reader can become lost, which is very easy to do. But was this a concept that James had planned early on in the writing of the book?
It was, originally when I had the first rough draft that Sam had cobbled together, because it was very separate. It had very disparate parts. Jim had mentioned frames in the introduction, so I took it a step further and added frame information in photo captions. And as a result, too, when I was aboard the ship, I took quite a few photos of frame numbers, since all of our interior is no longer there. And then, thinking too, we did want to appeal to both experts who knew how to operate ships, as well as amateurs or novices or who were new to the subject. So we tried to balance that. I had the idea of adding a glossary of nautical and marine terms for some of the terms that were in the book that may not be readily understandable.
Right.
So it dealt with, definitely making it simple for the average person to read, but also would allow experts and whatnot to learn something new about America's flagship.
There is no there's no stone left unturned in this book. And we just talked about the design and operation of the ship in the book, but there are entire chapters dedicated to the finer things on board, such as the beautiful artwork, the dining service, the chinaware, the silver, the menu items, the food stores that fed everyone on board. With all of the documentation and the detail that was collected, was that all part of Jim's collection, or did you and Sam have to tie up any loose ends on research or archive material?
Oh, most of the information did come from Jim's extensive collection that he removed from the ship, which honestly, I'm glad he did. Some people have been like, things should not be removed from the ship. Well, if he hadn't done it, somebody else would have, and it could have been very well lost to history.
Right.
So that majority of the information came from there. He also spent a lot of time in the Mariners Museum Library in Newport News and pulled a lot of archival information from there, as well, of course, his time aboard the ship. I mean, he spent many hours on the ship. And then he also had help from retired ship hands who knew the ship during her active service career, and he would, poke their brains, so to speak, and get more information that way. Now, Debbie, like I said, had given me all that documentation, And it took me, I'd say, about 3 or 4 months, and this was working on it every day because it was not in any type of order, and I had to go through 4 giant plastic bins worth, organized it, and I scanned every page, every form, report, ship's log, everything, thousands upon thousands of pages, and it's digitized now,
That's good.
and adds to the collection. Of course, the
Right.
Conservancy, I've shared that information with them, so they have it in their archives. Um, and then with it digitized, when things needed to be verified, which to be honest with you, I verified everything. Jim and Sam and I, we all have an attention to detail. And so I would verify it. It was easy to search once it was digitized using keywords. And then if there was something I couldn't verify in the documentation I had, I would look in it on my other SS United States books I had, reliable sources on the internet, or reliable sources that knew extensively of the ship, even more so than I do now.
Were you already technically acquainted with the United States as far as this type of material, or did this help build your knowledge of the ship?
It certainly helped build my knowledge. Now, I've had an interest in ocean liners since I was a little boy. So, I had some idea, but the extensive information that was out there, it was mind-boggling.
Yeah.
You got to think about it. This was in the time before computers, and like I said, there are thousands upon thousands. Some of it triplicated, I don't know, quadruplicated. I mean, just copies upon copies.
Yeah.
So yeah, and if it came down to something where I couldn't readily verify it, I always went to make sure I could verify it with 2 separate sources. That way I knew that I was pretty spot on with what the information was.
Now, you and I can both relate on how frustrating it is for us to have a deep interest about a ship and yet be too young to have that personal experience of what it was like to be on board, like the SS United States during her sailing career, or even being able to be on board while she was still intact. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that this has given you a greater appreciation for older generations that can share their personal experiences?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Sam mentions it in his afterwards that every day, we lose another person that's had a connection to the ship.
Right.
Or every year, I should say, every year we lose somebody or people that have had connection to the ship. So it's imperative that we do capture these stories, whether personal or professional stories, so that way they are saved for posterity, as well as for my information and the younger generation's information that have the interest in these type of ships.
I completely agree with that. Do you feel that you formed a bond with James Rindfleisch, even though you two have never had the opportunity to meet?
I would, yes, yeah, absolutely. I've multiple visits to Debbie's and Jim's house have certainly shown me who the man was.
Mm-hmm.
What his passions were, and of course, Debbie's stories that she tells me as well. So yeah, I do feel that I've gotten to know him. One of my greatest regrets is not having met the man when I had to, before he passed away. Of course, then there's the picture in my afterword that shows visiting the ship in '92, and as fate would have it, Jim's truck is passing by in one of those photos. I didn't know it at the time. I wouldn't find out whose truck that was until 25 years later when Debbie pointed it out to me and said, "That's Jim's truck."
Wow.
If only you know, you can say this as much as you want. If only I had known.
Right.
Because I remember I actually went up to the ship and knocked on an open gangway door to see about going in. And I remember the guard said to me, "No civilians allowed." Well, I have a pretty good feeling that if I had known Jim, I wouldn't have been able to get aboard.
Yeah. 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 You know, in gathering information for a book like this, it's a common occurrence that the amount of material gathered far exceeds what can be published in this one book. Do you see a potential for you and Sam maybe to co-write another book about the United States that covers topics that weren't mentioned?
Well, for Sam, this was a bucket list item, and he's crossed that off his list. I'm 100% sure that he isn't looking to add another book to his bucket list. If another one were to be done, I certainly would look at doing it solo. It does depend on how well this current book sells. Nearing the end of the publisher's reviewing process that we went through, I was gifted the 700 plus page specification book about the ship. And I was able to incorporate some additional information in the engineering section, which we kind of consider the keystone of the book. I could, at 700 pages, I could easily write 2 or 3 more volumes with additional information.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of technical information in them, and I find it all fascinating. But again, you kind of have to dumb it down a little bit because some of it is rather dry. But yeah, it's something that I could be interested in. I just would have to see how well this book does before I jump into possibly doing another one.
As the co-chair of the Hampton Roads chapter of the the SS United States Conservancy, can you give us an idea of what her current status is? I know that there are situations that are going on. I don't want to go into them now, but can you give us a little bit of her status?
Well, of course, the agreement with RXR Realty is still ongoing. COVID did slow down some progress, but it never stopped. So, I mean, the Conservancy continues to work with RXR. I actually, as a thank you to RXR, I sent them a complimentary copy. Unfortunately, I don't have anything concrete because that information is protected by non-disclosure agreements.
Sure.
But, you know, I'm in regular contact with Susan, Mark Perry, and, you know, they assure me that discussions are ongoing. RXR is definitely still interested, and, you know, they are looking to move forward. They are moving forward with this project. But as you can imagine, there are always multiple moving parts in, you know, refurbishing a 990-foot liner and finding a place to dock the ship.
I hope so. Do you feel optimistic? Are you optimistic about her future?
Yes, I am. A lot of it is because I've followed her since 1989. She's been with us for 50 years. I don't think that's a fluke. You know, like I said, the Conservancy, Susan Gibbs, and RXR, they're committed to it. I myself have, whether it's purchased or been given, several artifacts from the ship, some of it very unique, such as builder plates, lighted signs, cabinets from her dispensary. And I've refurbished all of this with the full intention of having it returned to the ship.
Wow. Well, Stanton, thank you very much for joining us today. And this is a wonderful book. And I recommend everybody it's on Amazon.com if you're looking for it, the SS United States, an operational guide to America's flagship. Stanton, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. Thank you.